Our first speaker is Evan Glassman. He is president and CEO of New Paradigm. He's going to discuss parametric insurance with us, as you know, because I think Sam mentioned that to you as well. And Don, Evan spent the better part of his career as an insurance agent in South Florida. He recognized that there was a tremendous difference between his clients' need to recover from hurricanes versus the coverage provided by traditional insurance policies, because it often takes months or years to process traditional insurance claims, as you all know. An alternative solution was not available at that time in the insurance market, so I'll leave it to him to tell you about what he did about that. Suffice it to say, he has hands-on experience with the benefits and shortcomings of traditional insurance in the disaster recovery setting, and plenty of knowledge to share with us today.
Thank you. So you touched on my background. I don't come from the insurance company side. I was an insurance agent in the Miami area, South Florida, and my client base was some of the larger structures, either high-rise condominiums or resort hotels that go up and down the coastline down there. And I was living firsthand with the products that the insurance industry were providing at that time weren't fully addressing the economic needs for recovery of policyholders. Visually, this represents insurance. On the left, the red shows where the problems are, and the green shows where there's coverage. It's a tower of cover, but it attaches excess of a deductible, which can be very meaningful the larger your exposure. There are exclusions within the policy. There's an adage that we like to use: the bold print giveth and the fine print taketh away when it comes to insurance. Not everyone's putting nice forms and endorsements in their policy like you are. But, and then the exposures that are most likely to produce loss are oftentimes not insurable, nor do they count towards the accumulation of your deductible liability, and that's by design. This is the stuff that's most likely to produce. Most insurance is purchased generally because it's a requirement. It's mandated either by a statute, by a lender, by a board. So it's evolved over time into providing a product that's not a complete solution. The claims process can also be quite lengthy and onerous. So what parametric insurance does is, rather than underwriting your underlying exposures, we're underwriting the probability of the event occurring. So if the wind blows significantly in your location, or storm surge level hits certain thresholds, or the ground shakes if you're earthquake exposed above predetermined thresholds, risk transfer is triggered. There's no monetary deductible, there's no exclusions, there's no adjusters, and the claims payment is almost immediate. In the case of Hurricane Maria, we had one policyholder in Puerto Rico at the time, paid in full 13 days post-landfall. There's no electricity in Puerto Rico. We had to wire the money to their Florida office. Hurricane Irma, 9 days. That's how quick this works. So it provides that immediate liquidity that you need. From what I understand, we're split about 50-50 between the public sector and the private sector in here. So for the public sector, we think of it as a three-legged stool because you're eligible for disaster grants from FEMA under the Stafford Act that the private sector's not. So you have insurance, you have FEMA, and then we become, as a parametric provider, the third leg of that stool. And what that does is it plugs the gaps. So there's certain things that are not eligible for recovery from FEMA. A lot of business interruption, so loss of tax base, loss of revenues, loss of permitting revenues, all of that stuff is not eligible for reimbursement. So with school districts, it could be the lunch money revenues that are generated, but all this stuff that becomes part of the budget. Insurance, as we talked about before, traditional insurance has its limitations. So with parametric, we become the third leg of a three-legged stool to offer a more complete risk transfer solution. Specifically for public entity, there's a lot of further confusion around what's covered or not covered. Post-Hurricane Matthew, we went to South Carolina. In that area, even though Matthew did not make landfall, it was about 30 miles offshore, we measured winds that were hurricane force in that area. And the trees there are very similar to trees here, very dissimilar to some of the trees in tropical locations in that they're going down. And the debris removal was tremendous. And there was a lot of confusion on the ground that we found, whereas certain things are not eligible for reimbursement from FEMA. So if you're picking up debris removal from private property, that's not eligible. So there were a lot of municipalities there got surprised when they went to submit for reimbursement from FEMA that things were not eligible, and this was stuff that was not budgeted and they had to come up with. So that's one of the things that we do. You have erosion and restoration of roads, beach erosion, parks, lakes, rivers. reduced or lost sales and property tax revenues. So if the area is affected, the harder it's affected, the bigger what's called the loss of attraction to that region could be. People, if you have tourists coming, they're not going to be coming. People are going to be leaving, they're not going to be spending money. So it's a two-edged sword where you're getting it on both sides in that you have all these losses and you don't have the revenues that you budgeted to come in to help make up for that. All expenses for overtime, storm preparation, storm cleanup, a lot of that can be reimbursed up to the co-payment percentage from FEMA, but it's still an immediate need for cash. And once again, if it's not in the budget, if there's not an emergency fund, what's the plan to come up with that? So where we fit here in this dialogue, in this conversation with Parametric, is a tool to be able to provide near immediate liquidity for any economic loss whatsoever, almost immediately following the storm. Now, Mike said something earlier that I use all the time. Wind speeds, the amount of damage and loss is not a linear function, it's an exponential function. So the harder the wind blows, the damageability gets much, much, much worse. This is a snapshot of the USVI, where they got hit with a true Category 5 in Hurricane Irma, and it is devastating. This highlights some of the differences in damage. Now, I know North Carolina was recently hit with Florence, which was a Category 1. One of our devices actually measured the strongest winds in Florence, but it knocks down trees, poles, landscaping, debris removal. You have a lot of loss from it, but it's generally not a catastrophic exposure. Category 2, damage is significantly worse. And then Category 3 or greater, you have imagery like we saw earlier that you put on with the video where you have critical infrastructure and critical damage to structures. Parametric is a tool to enable you to take an unknown, uncertain volatility from your budgets and balance sheets in the private sector, where you're replacing that with a known, quantifiable, budgeted item. So it's a tool to be able to plan for these things that unfortunately can and do happen. During Harvey, Irma, and Maria, these are some of the maximum wind speeds in each of these storms that were recorded over land. Now, this is not the estimation over water that you see in the news the National Hurricane Center does, but these are the actual on-the-ground 1 minute or 2 minute sustained average wind speeds. And if you look in Puerto Rico, 124.4 sustained on the ground. So that's why the damage was so terrible there. This is all of the storm tracks out there. So it's not if, but when. So it could be this year, I hope it's not. It could be 50 years from now, but it's not if, it's when. This is the Hurricane Irma footprint. The darker the color, the higher the wind speeds. The really dark red, that's Category 5 wind speed conditions. This is produced by one of our partner companies called RMS. They are a leading catastrophe risk modeling company. These footprints come out after every storm. But it just goes to show that there's extreme winds in some places and less extreme winds around it. But the one thing that's constant is there's always going to be loss around these types of events. What we do at New Paradigm that's a little bit unique around the technology side is we have proprietary technology to measure and reliably operate in the extreme conditions that hurricanes produce. These things are tested up to 140 miles an hour at the FAU wall of wind. That's as fast as it could go at the time. The instrument itself is rated up to 225 miles an hour. Most of them are on concrete poles that go between 11 to 17 feet into the ground. The genesis of the technology was following the active storm seasons in 2004 and 2005. It was recognized that there was a real lack of data around the wind speeds that hurricanes produce over land. The anemometers, that's what they're called, try saying that 3 times fast. The anemometers at airports or TV stations, they're not designed to reliably operate in these conditions, and oftentimes they fail. They just don't capture the peak wind data. So it was a Bermudian reinsurer and RMS collaborated with a meteorological data company called Weatherflow to create, test, install, and initially maintain this technology. But this technology enables us to reliably measure hurricane-force winds at very specific locations. In the private sector, we have risks where we install one of these devices, if it's meteorologically acceptable, at a client site or client location. So that reduces the potential for, the technical term is negative basis risk. Layperson terms, some stuff that none of us want is a misfactor or egg on your face. We want to make sure that these contracts trigger when they're expected to. So there's now this technology that wasn't around previously, and we're putting more and more of these in throughout the coastline here in North America as well as elsewhere in the world. However, getting to my miss point, we want to make sure that these contracts respond. If there's an expectation that they do, and there oftentimes can be a delta between what the National Hurricane Center estimates the storms to be versus what actual conditions on the ground. So as a provider, and we are not the insurance company, we are a specialist underwriter underwriting on behalf of various insurance companies, including TransRe, but we use a dual trigger where it's the higher of either the wind speed as measured or the storm track as set out by the National Hurricane Center and their advisories that they publish every 6 hours. Now, why this is to the benefit of potential purchasers is, let's use Hurricane Irma as an example. The strongest winds in Florida were actually measured not where Irma made landfall at Marco Island or the Keys, but in Port St. Lucie, Florida, which is north of West Palm Beach. That was 85.5 sustained. If you just did the distance from the storm, you'd have zero recovery, yet the 85.5-mile sustained winds are producing real loss on the ground. So in this instance, the actual measurement is to the benefit of the buyer. Same storm on the other side of the state. This is Naples. The National Hurricane Center is estimating it at 115 miles an hour. We have two devices that were directly in the storm's path. We got 83.3 sustained and another one slightly less. So in this case, they would receive a partial payout, or the buyer would receive a partial payout in that scenario, but a bigger payout based upon the storm track. So the dual trigger is to the benefit of the buyer. On the wind speed piece, how it works is predetermined location, 60-second, max 60-second, which is the same way hurricanes are categorized. It's called the Safer-Simpson scale. If storm conditions are present in the area for 9 hours, we take the maximum 1 minute during that 9 hours. However, it hasn't happened in 13 years, but inevitably Mr. Murphy is going to show up, and this technology, we like to say a rogue coconut's going to take it out. Something's going to happen, and we're not going to capture the complete data at that anemometer. And for that, we have a backup. So we are partnered with a company called RMS. RMS serves a very important role, and this is unique and different from most traditional insurance in that it's not the insurer or the counterparty that's determining what level of parameters are, what the wind speeds are. RMS serves as an independent third-party calculation agent. So there's no conflict of interest in this. This is open, transparent. The wind speeds can be monitored in real time, subject to cellular availability. The storm track is public data. So it's all designed to operate that way. One of the other issues with FEMA is there's a copay based upon the level of disaster declaration. Now, oftentimes the state funds are responsible for funding up to half of it, but it is politicized, it's different with every storm, and it's not consistent. So this is another gap in the availability of the grant money that can come to you. Parametric comes in and potentially solves this gap. The carriers that we utilize, just like TransRe, they're all AM Best A15, so A is high, a very high rating, A plus is higher, and then 15 is the financial category size, which means $2 billion or more in policyholder surplus. So it's all very, very secure. In the case of cat bonds, it's fully collateralized in a trust vehicle. So it's not something that's not going to be resilient financially when you need it. It's designed to be there and provide a good foundation for immediate liquidity. So getting into some live examples for this area, we have 3 anemometers in the area. We also designed circles and shapes that if the storm path goes through those, it triggers cover. And to give you guys an idea of what in this region, what this stuff like this costs, so you can plan for it, we're looking at around a 4%, so it's greater than a 1 in 20 payback. And the question that you need to ask is, do you think in the next 20 to 30 years, it's likely something's going to happen? And that's the payback period on this. But how this works is it's the highest. So the benefits always inure to the buyer. It's the highest of any of the triggers. So we have the 3 anemometers, and then we have the 2 boxes and the 1 circle. The payout pattern, it's more, we view the boxes and circles more as a net or a fallback in case the wind speeds are different from what the NHC estimates. But we're starting to attach at the beginning of a Category 1 with a 5% of limit payout. So if you bought $10 million, you get $500,000 at 74 miles an hour. And that payout percentage increases every single mile an hour, exhausting at 114. So the thinking there is you don't want to have an all or nothing, what's called a binary trigger. It increases the risk of a miss coming in. If you bought just Cat 2 and above, Mr. Murphy is going to show up and it's going to be 93 miles an hour. So you don't want to be in that situation. We don't want to be in that situation. Our carrier partners don't want to be in that situation. We want to make sure that we design a product that's going to be responsive. So we use what's called the step-up function on the payout. So you're getting recovery in just about any type of event, and you're getting a full recovery in anything major. So we can adjust this. The lower down we attach, the higher the price goes. The higher up we attach, the lower the price. Everyone likes the price of the stuff that's black swan or really in the tail. However, it's also very unlikely to occur. So we want to make sure that we're designing this so it's responsive to your needs. So it protects budgets, protects balance sheets, immediate liquidity. There are no adjusters, no exclusions, no deductibles, no attorneys or accountants involved in the process. And it's designed to, in most cases, supplement and to pick up the exposures that the insurance industry from a traditional basis does not affordably or efficiently cover, along with providing the immediate liquidity. All right. Thank you.